very pleased to be able to introduce Mercedes Bunz, who is young, but has had a very long and active life, packed with quite a few successful careers, achievements in very diverse fields, and quite some fame across a range of formats and countries. And generally, I will try to mention some of the threads of from this kind of intense career that I'll try to describe very briefly. So Mercedes was an inhabitant of the legendary Berlin of the 90s, with its techno scene and a critical and aesthetic force of inquiry into nascent technological forms. She was a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Debug, which was a magazine for electronic culture, started in 1997. So Debug is a legendary publication that covered a wide range of electronic culture-related phenomena, from music to fashion, net art and net criticism, politics and activism, and also some critical theory. She was also contributing to Boing Boing. I don't know, maybe you were an editor, I couldn't find that, but I remember you in there, another legendary publication. And it's interesting to look back today to think how this quite innovative publishing platforms shaped net culture and net critique. And they were not academic resources, but neither pop culture. And what the equivalent could be today, this fusion of music, art, thought around the real boom and development of open spaces, novel spaces with the World Wide Web, and all the related processes, the fruits of which, as we see now, turned quite sour in many ways. But that incredible richness at the time and multimodal, multi-format, really open inquiry became a mark of that time, and Mercedes was a big part of it. So I was recently reading an account of 90s Berlin techno scene published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, a novel called Rave by Reinhard Goetz, where I encountered a mention of Mercedes, which I read as a full of envy mention. And that was nice. So doing all of that, she also completed her PhD in Bauhaus University in Weimar in 2005 and had various fellowships and postdoc positions that I'm not going to list. And I'm also meeting all her other roles as editor and a founder of things. Between 2009 and 2010, she was a reporter for technology and media at The Guardian and moved to London. So I remember encountering you at some events around that time, and I assumed that the journalistic world bored you. And Mercedes accepted a position of the senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. And then in 2018, she moved to King's, where she's now. So quite a road. She's the author of The Silent Revolution, How Digitization Transforms Knowledge, Work, Journalism, and Politics Without Making Too Much Noise. She's the author with Graham Michael of The Internet of Things. She's the co-founder of Maison Press, which was initiated by her and two other people at the Hybrid Publishing Lab, of which she was director at Leuphana University at Lüneburg. And this is an initiative that looked into the effects of digitization on academic communication and publishing. It has since released some excellent titles, such as, for instance, Patent Discrimination, and is distributed by Minnesota University Press. And Mercedes co-wrote, which I believe is her most recent book, a volume called Communication for Maison Press. I also recommend one of her most recent articles on AI published in TCS, Theory, Culture and Society in 2019, The Calculation of Meaning on the Misunderstanding of New Artificial Intelligence as Culture. And also the AI Doctor Will See You Now, Assessing the Framing of AI in News Coverage, which was published in AI in Society, in the journal AI in Society. Also look out for her work with the Serpentine Gallery on the project on creative AI, machine learning as a medium in artistic and curatorial practice. Her funded work actually spans medical humanities and urban studies, and there are some also enigmas about some things, some of your activities, for instance, work with the cheerful disruptive character. She's a co-founder of Terra Critica, an international research network of humanities scholars focusing on critical and cultural theory, and bringing together theorists as well as practitioners in education, activism, and the arts. So I'm sure I've missed out a lot of other things and talked quite long. Let's extend our warm welcome to Mercedes. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you for coming for your lecture.
Thank you. That was a really lovely, well-researched summary of my professional life. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. And Lily, you warn me in case the connection is not very good.
Yeah, definitely. I'll let you know. Okay.
So you should be able to see yourself and this. I'm going to leave it like that. If it causes any problems, let me know. So time 6:38. So I'm going to talk roughly for hopefully just 45 minutes. So yeah, let's say around that time. Okay, let me start. So I'm talking today about artificial intelligence and the calculation of meaning. And these are the points I'm going to make, so you have a little bit of an orientation. How did I find my topic? How do I approach it? What do we understand wrongly about AI at the moment? What can be the reason for this misunderstanding? And then I step a bit sideways. And this is, first of all, because Olga is here, but also because recently, I finally managed to focus on an issue that fascinates me for very long, which is the question, why is it so difficult to criticize technology? And I'm going to talk about that via Antoinette Rouvroy, Olga, and Foucault and Deleuze. And then in the last bit, I will talk about my fascination from the non-functioning negation that we find with technology, as I will show, towards a critical engagement with technology via the computer scientist Phil Ager. So I'll try to do this within 45 minutes and be clear and entertaining, let's hope. So I'm going to start a little bit. So I wrote with my colleague Graham Meikle, The Internet of Things, this book, which was written and researched about the time of 2014. In this time, machine learning just really started to come up. So first of all, I traditionally research algorithms and how algorithms change the relation of power and knowledge. And of course, I mean, something changed when things all of a sudden become connected. So we split the book up, and my parts were to talk about speaking things and seeing things. And seeing things naturally sort of led me to machine learning and self-driving cars. And I came across this absolutely fantastic data set that had been created by Fei Li back at the time, which was really innovative, ImageNet. Yeah, so I got really fascinated by the technical details, as you can see. And when I moved to King's College, that immediately became some practice work around that. We did a few workshops, how to open up the black box of machine learning. And that then led to the Creative AI Lab, which I run in collaboration with Eva Jäger at the moment. And in case you're interested, we are publishing, for example, tools artists can work with machine learning and that make it easier, and some essays and introductory material, podcasts, and so on, all around creative AI. So still here we are very much at the back ends of AI, and I will talk about that in a second. So this is broadly the research stuff I'm doing now. The question that fascinated me is, how can we understand the new intelligence of machine learning, and what do we understand wrongly about it at the moment? And that led to two texts, and I will the presentation today is a bit mixture of both. One is called The Calculation of Meaning on the Misunderstanding of New Artificial Intelligence as Culture in Culture Theory and Critique. And the other one, not published yet, is called How Not to Be Governed Like That by Our Digital Technologies. And for most of you, you will see that How Not to Be Governed Like That is a classic Foucault quote. And I'll return to that. So the question I start with is, where is human intelligence situated? And I follow the French paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gourand here, who you can see here venturing out of Paris to go and do some field work with his friends. And he wrote this book, which fascinated me for several reasons: Gesture and Speech, and a theory he follows. And there is: the intelligence of human thought cannot be situated in the brain alone. It extends to the tools we think and work with. And that is quite interesting also, because this is a screenshot of two of his chapters in this book. And you can see that the language, the book is written in the 60s, 64 at MIT Press, the translation. It's French, of course. It's very computer scientific. So he talks about operations, operational sequences, programs, and so on and so on. He was an anthropologist. When I show this to data scientists, they go like, wow, that's super interesting. And I think it actually is. So the question we can ask with him is, where would our intelligence be in a world in which there are no books and nothing can be written down? And we can take this question to machine learning and ask, where is our intelligence in a world with deep learning, and to what extent is that a different intelligence? So deep learning and machine learning, and I'll explain that the technology a little bit more in a minute, is a specific way of artificial intelligence that really got developed further around 2012 to 2015. It made two big jumps through deep convolutional neural networks, or new systems of machine learning, in short, and it's quite fascinating. So I want to ask how we can understand this specific contemporary intelligence, deep learning, machine learning, and what do we understand wrongly about it at the moment. So let's start with look at what could possibly go wrong. And I brought a little clip to show this. So this is a small boy who asks Alexa to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And this is what happens.
Play Ticker Ticker. Alexa, play Ticker Ticker.
Bobby, can you tell it to play Wheels?
You want to hear a station for porn detected. Porno ringtone, hot chick, amateur girl, calling sexy.
No.
Hot pussy, anal dildo, ringtone.
Alexa, stop!
So, yeah. You can see it goes horribly wrong. What is the reason? Alexa has no control for what happens when not adults but children use it. And Amazon much later started to integrate this. And this is from January 2017, where this was not yet in place. Stuart Russell, who's professor of computer science at the University of California, said, you make machines that are incredibly competent at achieving objectives, and they will cause accidents in trying to achieve those objectives. And while what we just saw is a bit of sweet and funny, other things are not, like the death of Elaine Herzberg in March 2018, who got struck by a self-driving Uber, or the first death here of Joshua Brown in the Tesla car, where he had the autopilot on. And since that, there are several deaths with a Tesla autopilot. And it's quite amazing that this is, despite several deaths, allowed on our streets. Something that started to fascinate me is that we can see that everywhere around us, beta versions become integrated into our world. New artificial intelligence does not seem in much need of test environments. The testing of this technology happens in our everyday world. And there are a lot of examples. This is an early one, and unfortunately, this goes on until now. So this is from 2015, when Google Photos was rolled out, and immediately a Black woman and her friend were categorized as gorillas. And Jackie Elsin, who's a web developer, sort of published that and immediately got to the point, what kind of sample image data did you collect that resulted in this? So It's a classic problem we still have. We just had the case that on Twitter and on Zoom, where we all are at the moment, works really well with white faces. If you don't have white skin, it might be that Zoom thinks you're part of the background. And that is another case that we see where machine learning algorithms get it all wrong. What's quite interesting is that the approach of this technology towards reality is very different from what we know from the 20th century, when we had tests and experiments as a defining genre and form of governance in Western societies. Yaron Ezai called it theaters of accountability. And to go back to that, there is an absolutely fantastic film by Harun Farocki, the artist, called Life in in German it's called Leben BRD, Life in the in Germany. I just translated like that now. And he just shows many ways how we test life, like lots of examples. It's a fantastic film, and the approach today couldn't be more different. We don't have those theaters of accountability anymore. And Noortje Maris has recently worked and also published about that. And together with David Stark, she ran Put It to the Test workshop I took part in. And the introduction she wrote, "We are struck by the proliferation today of forms of testing explicitly designed to implement experiments in social settings, from living labs to street trials." So I was quite fascinated for this, that we have a premature acceptance of new artificial intelligence systems everywhere. And I was wondering what could be the reason why, if even deaths occur, if they go constantly wrong, if it's very clear our artificial intelligence and algorithms are biased, why have we no problem? Why isn't there more of an outcry to say, stop, we don't want them, they're not tested enough, they can't be on our streets? I mean, for example, Britain and London run self-driving cars all the time. The tests are going on around Stratford, but nowadays all over the city. So my question is, what is different with this technology and new so that it's so other than what had happened in the 20th century? Now, machine learning, the technology I'm fascinated with, led to advances in a wide range of fields, from speech recognition and natural language modeling to visual object recognition and object detection. So you know it from these applications, or the AlphaGo win, or simple translations. And we all use it every day when we text and get suggested which words we're going to use. But we need to understand that machine learning is not just a new technology advancing computer science through pattern recognition. For a very long time, algorithms struggled to deliver results in any areas that involved meaning. So algorithms traditionally fail to process symbolic information packed with meaning, images, language, symbols. And the reason is, of course, that meaning is in a gray area. Machine learning was the first time that computer science could enter this new dimension, which I call the calculation of meaning. The term calculation of meaning signifies for us here that machine learning crosses over into the field of cultural symbols, that is, encoding and decoding of symbolic forms. And calculation of meaning is a very particular kind of intelligence and of processing meaning. And that's quite important to understand. A lot of times we just say, oh, artificial intelligence can now understand faces, or it can now, Olga has worked about that, or we can analyze language really well. But it's really important to understand in what way it is approaching our world. So it is a very different intelligence from the human intelligence, which every one of us can easily see by the example that we know that we can show a cat to a child and it can recognize cats from there on. One single cat is enough for a child to know, a certain age given, of course, that is a cat. But we need hundreds or thousands of cats for a machine learning system to be able to recognize cats. And that is a really important difference in intelligence. And I also brought an example, which I find really good, the deep visualization toolbox. Because we all, a lot of times we say, oh, we don't know, we can't, it's a black box, we can't look in the black box of machine learning, which is actually not true. I would never call it a black box anymore. I would now only call it a gray box, and there are ways to open it. And I think this is quite a short and good film that demonstrates how machine learning works. On the left upper side, you see an image here from a Yorkshire Terrier. And on these little squares, on all the black squares, you can see what the neural network, which has different nodes, see and what they fire upon. And the film explains it probably much better than I do. So just like.
We developed this interactive deep visualization toolbox to shine light into these black boxes, showing what happens inside of neural nets. In the top left corner, we show the input to the network, which can be a still image or video from a webcam. These black squares in the middle show the activations on a single layer of a network, in this case the popular deep neural network called AlexNet running in Caffe. By interacting with the network, we can see what some of the neurons are doing. For example, on this first layer, a unit in the center responds strongly to light to dark edges. Its neighbor, one neuron over, responds to edges in the opposite direction, dark to light. Using optimization, we can synthetically produce images that light up each neuron on this layer to see what each neuron is looking for. We can scroll through every layer in the network to see what it does, including convolution, pooling, and normalization layers. We can switch back and forth between showing the actual activations and showing images synthesized to produce high activation. By the time we get to the fifth convolutional layer, the features being computed represent abstract concepts. For example, this neuron seems to respond to faces. We can further investigate this neuron by showing a few different types of information. First, we can artificially create optimized images using new regularization techniques that are described in our paper. These synthetic images show that this neuron fires in response to a face and shoulders. We can also plot the images from the training set that activate this neuron the most, as well as pixels from those images most responsible for the high activations, computed via the deconvolution technique. This feature responds to multiple faces in different locations, and by looking at the deconv, we can see that it would respond more strongly if we had even darker eyes and rosier lips.
Okay, I think that's enough. I show this to make everyone, I think it's a really good example to make us understand what goes on inside a neural network and why it makes mistakes and how it operates and how it works. And this one obviously like rosy lips. So I think we can say that the calculation of meaning is a form of being intelligent in a very particular way. And as we have just seen, it approaches the world on the level of the smallest element. So the film just showed it starts by dark to light edges, light to dark edges, and then goes on to higher features. But it approaches the world on the level of the smallest element, on pixels really, and interprets the elements statistically and has a probabilistic intelligence. And that is quite important to know. And given the fact that this technology is implemented everywhere, something we should work and be aware of much more. I would now call the calculation of meaning a new form of intelligence. I wouldn't call it an understanding of meaning. And there are some interesting discussions you have, especially with older computer scientists who really don't like this. We also went for a Google grant, and the Google people first said, well, what do you mean calculation of meaning? But yeah, there's obviously something happening in between the understanding and the calculation. And there's a different form of being intelligent all of a sudden among us. So one of the theses that we can discuss later is new AI is crossing over into cultural terrain by calculating meaning. I think when I wonder why do we employ those artificial intelligence systems in our midst, I would say my thesis is unfamiliar with our new intelligence. We mistake the calculation of meaning as the form we know from culture, that is as an understanding of meaning, and that is why we integrated too early into our world. Now, coming to the theoretical part one, how are technical objects and cultural objects situated differently in the world? That was the question I asked myself then, and what is their difference? And of course, I did that with one of my favorite philosophers, Gilbert Simondon, who really explores technology also on the smallest element. And in the third part, I think it's in chapter 3 of this book, he writes about the difference between the aesthetic object and the technical object, which is quite interesting. Those of you who have read a lot about aesthetics and are into contemporary art, he has quite a traditional understanding of art, but nonetheless, it is interesting. So he defines both areas, aesthetics and technology, as a mediation between man and nature, but in different ways. He writes the aesthetic object is linked to the world and to man, and also linked to other works as a unique intermediate reality. The aesthetic universe is partial, integrated, and contained in the real and actual universe. And he says the technical object is detached from the world and applicable to any point and at any moment. And the technical object intervenes as a mediator between man and the world. So if we compare them directly, we have one that is an intermediary world, while the other one is an intermediary tool, and the aesthetic object is integrated into the world that it extends, while the technical object mediating with the world from which it is detached. So, can we get this further up here? But if we go back with this to what is the reason for our premature acceptance of new artificial intelligence systems, and where does this tendency to deploy them too early come from, we could say, okay, machine learning has entered the sphere of meaning for sure, as we humans are only familiar with an integrated understanding of meaning. We mistake the intelligence of machine learning for the integrated object we know from culture, but calculation isn't understanding meaning. Given the fact that being intelligent usually has limits, we should set out to explore the form of intelligence introduced by machine learning to learn to better collaborate and live with it. And with this, we are in part 2. And the real theoretical part starts, how to live with or criticize technology. And I'll start this journey from the word detached, which fascinated me for very long. So Simondon writes, the technical object mediating with the world is detached from the world. And of course, the reason, I mean, he wrote the book in 1958. So it is, he's obviously writing about machines and tools. The reason is, of course, that for him, he argues a technical object needs to be applied to a range of different situations. And that's the reason why it needs to be detached. But the detachment leads to an interesting problem when we talk about criticizing technology. What fascinates me for very long is there's something not working in our critique of technology. And I followed for very long, not knowing what to do with it, a phenomenon. And that's the fact that we are concerned about technology, but don't act on it. And I'll bring a few examples. One was the disclosure of personal information we all do on social media, or most of us do, a lot of us do on social media. And really early on, I remember there was this Leave Facebook Day. That was really literally in 2010 or something. And my whole environment was excited about that day. Hey, there's the Leave Facebook Day coming up. And then that day came and nobody left. Everyone was still on Facebook. That sort of mirrors something that you find, and I haven't quoted those studies here, but there are several sociological studies that show that users are really concerned about the usage of their data, but keep on using and publishing information. And sociologists ask themselves, how does this come? So there's obviously a sort of really weird gap. So this gap you can find everywhere. For example, my next example is the monopolistic power of Google. Now, coming from Germany, I know, and I also researched that that there's no other country where the outrage about Google is so strong. Germany is one of the 3 countries where the street vision project got officially stopped because people didn't want to have their houses on Google Maps. People are demonstrating against Google and so on, so on. Interesting, Google also at the same time has one of the highest percentages of usage as a search engine. So in Germany, the usage of Google is 95%. 95% of internet users are using Google. In America, for example, it normally is between, keeping from year to year, changing a bit, 65 to 69%, because people use other searches from DuckDuckGo to Bing or other companies. And that's also something that fascinates me, really, the strong outage and the strong usage, that they don't go together really. And the last example is the surveillance problem. We all remember Edward Snowden and the US mass surveillance leak in 2013. And again, this is a personal anecdote, but back at that time, I sort of looked how many email addresses I had. I had 2,144 email addresses at that time in my also Google Mail, obviously surveyed. And I got one single email by a person saying, I'm going to switch to an account that cannot be surveyed. And that was my uncle Axel, who wrote to me and did that. And he used to work for the EU. So that is also, he was the only one who said, I have a new email address. I get rid of all my other email addresses. This one can be tapped by the US. So please use that from now on. And I was quite, because there was so much, again, anger in my environment, that this, again, fascinated me, including myself. I didn't switch my email address either. So in all 3 cases, we find critique as well as existent alternatives that could lead to a negation of the status quo, but no action is taken by us, the technical subjects. And that question, why is that? Sort of I put to the back of my mind for several years, until I came across those 2 texts here. Okay, now this is Antoinette Rouvois' The Ends of Critique and Olga's The Digital Subject. Okay. Computer doesn't want to work anymore. So what I find quite interesting is that both realize a certain detachment and a certain distance. So Rouvois writes about, she writes about algorithmic governance, and she sort of noticed quite early in 2013, the new algorithm, the world of big data. Knowledge is not produced about the world anymore, but from the digital world, a kind of knowledge that is not tested by or testing the world it describes and emanates from. Algorithmic reality is formed inside the digital reality without any direct contact with the world it is aimed at representing. So here we have a detachment or distance. Yeah, and we have, again, a kind of knowledge that is not tested, to link back to an earlier topic. She notes an effect on subjectivity. She writes, algorithmic power operates with infra-individual data and super-individual patterns without at any moment calling the subject to account. Now, this is something Olga has researched in much more detail, coming up with the form of a digital subject, a new form of subject construction that arises out of computational procedures. And Olga also writes, there are no data shadows, but the digital subject needs to be understood as fragments and shreds. And what really fascinates me was the notion of distance that is really, really strong in her text. The notions of distance is key to conceptualizing the digital subject. She writes, distance is the mechanism through which algorithmic governance rules. A digital subject is neither a human being nor its representation, but a distance between the two. And the power mechanism of algorithms operates by setting up a non-relation, by establishing a distance. And that is the reason for all that odd behavior, us being concerned, but trapped in a non-relation, obviously. Yeah, there's something that we think we can't act. When we act directly, it wouldn't affect the technological company or power. So what do we do now, and why does critique not work? So I summarize several points now, probably too complex to put them in a short lecture, but yeah, let's try. So why does critique not work? What is the mechanism of critique would be the next question we ask. So let's go to Daddy Foucault and ask. Because Foucault is known as have written those texts, What is Critique, or he also has a very clear conceptualization of power and resistance in History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And so I sort of reread all those texts. And when he writes How Not to Be Governed Like This, and in our case, that is by our digital technologies, for Foucault, that was something we cannot do anymore. So Foucault writes that the critical practice lies in the subjugation of the subject. And he writes, where there's power, there's resistance. Sentences we're probably all familiar with, but we know that this subject doesn't work anymore. He also states, and this can be something that might be more useful, power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. So what is quite interesting is that digital technology obviously make up a field that operates fundamentally different to politics. It's not counting, it's calculating. Olga describes that with the shreds of the digital subject really well. And the calculating devalues the subject. The subject is nothing but something we could call even a prompt that sets a calculation in motion. But this calculation also means there's no representational force. So there's no direct link where there's power, there's resistance. And negation doesn't work with calculation. The calculation, as Olga writes, is fundamentally opposed to relation. And Rouvroy also says, algorithmic governmentality is a mode of governmentality without negativity. So how are we not governed like this by our digital technologies? Can we find a way around the negation? Now we turn to the next study. I just called them because ever since I started reading theory, these were sort of the holy saints and figures, and we never seem to come really any further. But yeah, it was worth rereading them. And I know they're sort of completely out of fashion for some people, and they think you cannot read Deleuze anymore or something, which I disagree with, obviously. So Gilles Deleuze describes now, trying to move away from negation, the concept of affirmation, indifference, and repetition. And the interesting thing is that Deleuze and Foucault also share a common philosophical gesture. So Deleuze's book has been reviewed by Foucault, and Foucault then says we must think problematically rather than question and answer dialectically. So can we turn this to his own thinking? How not to be governed like this? Can we turn the not into thinking problematically? Foucault spoke of the multiplicity of force relations. So what other problematical relations can there be apart from oppositional ones? Is there another option in entering the force relations, for example, via problematization? So you can see here, there's a bunch of texts you have to go through with me now. I'm sorry. Deleuze's affirmation is interesting. I'm not going into it in detail because it's slightly mad, but it is for sure double twisted. It's not simply affirming something, and that's quite important to know. Deleuze makes it very clear that just switching from negative to a positive attitude is not deemed radical enough. According to him, such a move will still remain in the framework of practicing dialectics. So it's not just being against technology, now being for technology. That would be too easy. He says we need to generate radical difference, a difference that is at the same time, and he says, different in itself. So he doesn't describe affirmation as a relation. It is not the affirmation of something one is for. And we know from having read Digital Subjects from Olga that technology also operates with a non-relation. So far, we seem to be on a good way to find maybe a different way of critique. For Deleuze, affirmation is a process that is creative and is producing something. Whoever wants to really go into the deep end of Deleuze, there's a part with the dice which is quite weird and super interesting. I love very much, but I thought I spare you this. And I explained the situation more with Foucault. So Foucault said, again, this dice example is to explain the problematization, and Foucault embraces this as well, as I already said. And for both, affirmation is a process that is creative and producing something. So the problematization is not to say there's the problem, we are against this, but more curious problematization, and that wants to find out what else could happen. So this is something that unfolds through the creation of a problem that has not been set up intentionally, but that happens through chance, that is a Deleuze word, which needs to be affirmed to allow it to constitute its own structure. Again, a very Deleuzian. So what we happen here is a different form of affirmation. We have an affirmation that is different in itself. We have an affirmation that is not set up intentionally, but just goes out to understand a problem and trying to change it. My fan wants to speak with me now. So in the text I wrote, I wanted to return to technology and not just end with Deleuze. And I think, so my question was, how can we problematize technology? How could we criticize AI? And the text I turned to then was Phil Ager. He vanished in the last years. You can still just vanish from Earth, 2010, I believe it was. He used to work at the computer science department in San Diego and wrote many really interesting texts. And one of them is Towards a Critical Technical Practice, Lessons Learned in Trying to Reform AI. And that's the last part I go through, and then I'm finished. So Ager, and here you can see the end already, some more slides, and you're done. And I look forward to your questions. So Ager, then, who you can see here, tries to problematize technology, in particular AI. He sits at a particular moment in history with artificial intelligence. There's a paradigm change against a rule-based symbolic approach to a more interactive artificial approach. Well, that's just for background. And the interesting thing is, I mean, really, you should read the text. It's very biographical. It's sort of, it weaves theory in everyday life and his own struggles, which is quite an interesting text genre, I have to say. He describes his way of moving from one paradigm, the rule-based symbolic approach, to a new paradigm, which is more interactive in AI. And he describes what problems he encountered, how other people reacted in his department and his discipline, and the problems he had. And in the end, he comes up with this critical practice that he says, the way of moving to a new paradigm is by forming a problem. We cannot say it shouldn't be an alternative. He says the very concept of alternatives is misleading. And this is very close, of course, to what Deleuze says. Now, what exactly is it that makes Ager's approach critical? I mean, that's quite nice. He thought it shouldn't be alternative. It's a forming of a problem together. But Ager sort of tries to spell this out, and he says it's impossible to achieve a radical break with the existing methods of the field. The goal of the critical technical practice should be complex engagement and not a clean break. Could this be, that is a question we can discuss later, an approach that the technical practice and the critique of technology is not to be against something, saying you did it wrong, you need to do it better, but could it be a complex engagement? So this is the position he definitely has. He is up for a critical engagement and maintaining constructive engagement. And he says that a technical production needs to span borderlands, bridging the disparate sides of practice that computer work brings uncomfortably together. What does this mean for criticizing technology? And then I'm nearly done. Asking uncomfortable questions. I brought a few questions with me. How is a calculation configured? What are the technical reasons for configuring it like this? What situations are produced by the configuration? Which ones have been forgotten and ignored? But also, who controls the distance in which the digital subject is produced? Who can break this distance down? When should it be broken down? And these questions do not negate, but they constructively engage with the technology and situation it produces. And I think that's quite important, because a lot of critique we see now is like splits the field. The ethical critique is a lot of times done on the sociological side against the computer scientists, and that it could be a way around it. What I asked myself, and why I think to explore this further, which I will not do now because I'm going towards the end, is I think digital technologies such as AI and platforms have become so central in our societies that we need to engage with them more and also collaborate and control them more. I think for this, we need to leave the notion behind that they are instruments, and instruments that should function. It's not just, and that's quite difficult to really leave the notion behind that a technology should function. All of us now know how frustrated we are if our computer doesn't work. We expect from technology that it works. We don't expect that we have to do work with it. And this would be the switch that I'm asking for. Ager's critical technical practice could be read as a call for a collectively produced technology that is constantly evolving, an algorithmic practice that is always generating new additional questions to which engineers, media and technology scholars and the communities they work in, with or for need to turn in order to critically explore the force relations and adjust the algorithmic practice version by version. And the question I end with is, can we embrace the brittleness of our systems and their specific calculating intelligence by understanding and respecting their strength and limits in our workings with technology? And that's it.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. I will ask first my question myself. I'll take the power in my hands and ask a question, and then open the floor. First, I want to thank you for such a deep engagement with my work, and it's very interesting. I definitely did not think about things that way, and so it's fascinating to see what you can get out of there. And obviously it gave me a lot of material to think with. And I have a question for, I mean, it's more like a comment, and it's not easy to answer, and you won't thank me maybe for that. But when you think about the distance and this kind of non-relation in relation to Simondon's kind of positioning, because that's how you positioned it, that technology is detached, and aesthetic objects are integrated. So it's also very Bakhtinian in a way, like, you know, this kind of sense in which your aesthetic understanding of me completes me as a subject, and your aesthetic understanding, my aesthetic understanding of you completes you as a subject. So it's very relational. So I can understand. I don't remember that particular part, and I'll reread it. But I imagine that Simondon means something like that. That aesthetics is like such a core part of our life and us being human, that is like integrated and technology is detached. So it's very interesting. But then my question is, do you think they're now merging? Like that's where the problems come, the political problems, that there is now a sense in which technology detachment is attaching to the and kind of integrating into the aesthetic mode.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, I think they are. I would, but that's an intuition more than, you know, something I can prove. There's definitely a shift happening. I mean, you can see that. I just had a discussion with a US computer scientist who then talks about the mechanisms of calculating meaning, but is completely against to say we can calculate meaning. That's not possible. But I think it is, and it becomes. And when you ask, are these fields merging? I would say, yes, they are. and we don't know how to deal with it really yet. And that's where we are so confused, because we try to be critical with our old subject and our old way of critique, which doesn't work in the new way. But I'm now then, and I haven't done that work, somebody needs to do that. I'm not sure in which way they're merging. I'm pretty sure you can describe this in more detail, because sometimes I think it just looks like they're merging. And the reality is that if you start to look at it in more detail, you could see that one field is still functioning in the old way, and they're not just simply merging. So there is a shift happening, but I think one needs to really describe it in really great detail to understand what is merging and what isn't.
Thank you very much.
But I think, yeah, I really love your text, and I really think there's so much in this, and especially also, yeah, the distance, I mean, the non-relation really causes myself a big problem, because I really find it hard to think with it and think through it. And sort of the Phil Agar-Deleuze thing is one way to just go sideways. But I still think, you know, we need to come up with a theory what it means that machine learning is not creating a relation, but is working with a calculation that is in place of that. And that's actually something that also the Google people found really interesting. There are a few people, Ramon Amaro is one as well, who tries to think about what can that mean. But I think we're just starting to understand that this is going on.
Thank you. Please, can I open to the floor? If people want to pose a question in the chat, they can do so, or they could raise hand by clicking on reactions, and there's a button raise hand, or just unmute yourself and just start speaking.
The first question always takes a while.
Maybe I can just sort of jump in there. Thank you for this great talk. I can imagine that it was like sort of a lot. So maybe, you know, everybody needs a little bit of time to sort of process. But yeah, it was like fascinating. And I really did enjoy your references to the daddies. Yeah, it's really interesting to actually encounter this material in this context for me. But I wondered whether, you know, what the question of sort of creativity and how that might come into your thinking, because in particular thinking with Deleuze, I had this, because I guess the question with calculation is also that it's sort of, you know, it's it always operates with pre-existing material. So there's almost a sense in which it kind of like precludes novelty. And I always think about this in terms of kind of like the, you know, with AI producing art or producing text, and how the creativity actually is like happens without imagination. So you always need a human being to sort of, you know, produce a kind of, to make whatever random text meaningful, for example. But in the field of aesthetics, I guess, you know, the kind of like the way that algorithms are used, for example, to produce a new Picasso or whatever, is sort of like, it's, you know, more of the same. I wondered like whether, yeah, whether that's something that sort of enters your thinking, and whether, for example, what it means for the future, because I'm always interested in that, sort of like how are these, you know, mechanisms actually prepared to encounter new situations, and whether that's also kind of like where they fail in relation to sort of like the real world or like human subjectivity.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's an interesting point, the creativity and the algorithms. I think it moves depending on where you put, the agential cut, you could say, with Barat. You spoke about those. There's, for example, the next Rembrandt, the project by IBM, really early. Joanna Zielinska describes it as well, where the algorithms are trained in creating a really beautiful 3D printed Rembrandt picture that has been unveiled in Amsterdam as the new Rembrandt. And of course, we also now read the GPT-3 texts that write books like here, no, it's in the other room, The Anomaly of AI, and to sort of start to write text. And that idea is very, yeah, you know, it's like, oh yeah, it's, you know, it's fun in the beginning, but then it becomes boring. But to be honest, I mean, we do this work now with the Creative AI Lab. So we interview artists, how they use machine learning, how they see it, what they do with the back end, and so on. And there are a range of artists, like Alison Parrish is poet, for example, or Anna Riedler, or Robbie Barrett, who uses it for creating paintings, who program their own machine learning systems and feed it with their own data, and then use it more as tools. Especially Alison's work is quite interesting because she uses it to explore language and come up with words that are not existing. And plays around with it. So she really uses machine learning to explore language more, and tries to find out about well, we know from Shannon that language is redundant, but, you know, sort of test it out. How far can it go? When does it shift over to not being understandable? And because in the backend you can, you know, like make the parameters, the word length, the phonetics, all of this, you can sort of play around with it in a really nice way. So I think these artists use it in a very different way where new things are existing. And we also know this from the typical AI art, you know, when you train an AI on animals and then you show it a picture of a cloud and it sees lots of weird animals that do not exist in the clouds. Some of these things are just fun. Sometimes artists use them to understand new ways of technical seeing, or new, and that point it becomes interesting, because the truth is that creativity, of course, tools are always part of creativity and technology. There is no creativity without material, and technology is material. So the tools are not against each other, and the machine learning is not replacing the human, but it's more that the human uses it as a tool, and then I think it works quite well. And it's super interesting also to explore machine learning and systems and how they work, because they are odd. And you know, we don't have a lot of things apart from Excel spreadsheets to explore big data, and machine learning is much more fun to explore big data than Excel sheets, I have to say.
It's really interesting, you know, before you, like a week ago, we had Cornelia Zollfrank talking about how, like, the 90s idea of net art and software art ideas of co-authorship with software and co-authorship, how thinking about what is the authorship role of the technical piece algorithm you work with, how it kind of now brought back to life through machine learning, and the same question kind of comes back, but also with the session we had with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who also trained the AI for music. And so it actually, like, the whole program seems to come back to your idea of working with technology, like in
Yeah, I mean, we are discussing it, like, now you can see that artists who, there are artists that can program themselves, but now we work more and more with pre-trained models. There are also artists that use tech people to work with them. Hito Style does that a lot. She works with Jules Laplace. So I think, but it definitely comes back that the software has its own role, or a stronger role. Yeah.
I also want to encourage people to ask questions, because sometimes these topics can seem difficult, but don't be ashamed to ask a question that you think might be silly, because there are no silly questions.
Yeah, you can also just comment. You don't need to ask a question.
Yeah, this Paulina.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Okay, I'm not from humanities, I'm a technologist. And I think I have a very simple answer to the question that you asked at the beginning. Why do we adopt artificial intelligence systems so quickly if they're so bad? And I guess my answer to that is that in some areas they work amazingly well. And that from the technical point of view, that is the breaker. When you see, I remember the time when machine learning came around, and then the next stage when deep learning came around, and you see such a like 2 orders jump in the quality of the output that the systems produce. That is I don't know if that is a change of paradigm. That's probably not at that stage, but you definitely if you call artificial intelligence anything that computers couldn't do before and can do now, then that's exactly one of these points. So I think that was a simple reason. People just see systems work so good, and in many cases better than humans. And that's why they adopt them. And that they don't work in other situations or with other data, we find out over time. That takes time to find out. And I guess that's the other remark I wanted to make, because when you start talking about AI, machine learning in that very general terms, you lose exactly that nuance, because they work very differently in different contexts. And even if we just talk about broad contexts like language or music or images, that's very specific what they can do in these areas and what they can't. So I think that should be approached separately. And in terms of working with machines, with algorithms, I very much agree with your conclusions. We definitely come closer to the time where we are going to be producing with algorithms, not expect them to work or to do everything for us. There will be, I think, more and more of that mutual creation, even in simple situations. If you look at recommendations, for example, with which I work a lot at this point, to produce really good recommendations, you need the user to give you something, to put some effort into adjusting the system to their needs. And how we do that, that's, I guess, a different question, but and I agree, this is the direction we're moving to.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really like the idea, and I think that's also something everyone should develop further, how to work with algorithms and with systems. And it is quite interesting that I think we're at the moment, thank God, moving slowly away from the idea that machine learning is automatizing, but more that it is suggesting solutions we can then easily adopt. You can see that all the excitement that was around 2015 about self-driving cars has stopped quite a lot. And the reason is we have a really difficulty to get self-driving cars to a collaborative moment, because if they make a mistake, we have to decide in a split second that we have to jump in and stop us from dying and driving against a wall. And that is not a good collaboration, because it's nearly not doable. While in other moments, like, for example, phone text suggesting, oh, do you want to say this word, makes it typing much faster. And that is a really, really good collaboration. And there are other forms now. I'm working a bit about medical image recognition. And there you can see that they develop systems where they show not just the algorithm's decision, but also the field why the algorithm has decided something, to show then to the doctor. And then the doctor can decide if the algorithm is correct or not. And these are then deciding with the algorithm more than the algorithm decides instead of the human. And I think that's a direction that's really interesting. Yeah, and what I really love about, and I want to have time to explore further, but I couldn't, I completely agree that the systems are fascinating and work really super well. I'm really also fascinated in those moments when they don't work well. So I have this other research strand where I look at AlphaGo, for example, failing. The DeepMind playing system lost 4-1. And the one game it lost is quite interesting what happens in the back end. You can see this in the film on Netflix, AlphaGo, where everybody runs it then together of the DeepMind team and looks what happens. And Demis Hassabis comes in and says, I think the algorithm's deluded, and sort of completely anthropomorphizes it. It's quite sweet. But what I'm quite fascinating is that they work so well, and then they sort of break down all of a sudden completely without telling you, and then they go back up and work really well. And that is also for us humans a very new way of understanding, not understanding, and we are not really used to this, because if a machine breaks down from the mechanical age, you can slowly hear, okay, your washing machine's going towards the end, and now that's it. While in the algorithm world, it goes, doesn't work, works really perfectly. And this switch is on off. And I'd like to explore this further. There are also examples in image recognition where the algorithm is constantly fooled by images which human eyes can easily identify as something else. And all these examples are super fascinating, but now I'm blabbering.
Yeah, I think what is quite interesting are the areas where there is no right answer, like say in music. If, for example, in language, you can always say whether a sentence makes sense and adheres to the rules. In music, it's very difficult, and that's one of the most difficult types of data for machine learning still. And I must admit, at this moment, I'm actually probably doing this transition to a new paradigm, because I've recently got access to GPT-3.
Hey, nice.
I'm now organizing, I'm organizing a hack week for my team at where I work to try out GPT-3 for various tasks. That's absolutely fascinating. So that completely breaks all my learned knowledge about how to do machine learning. So to me, this is actually the paradigm change, because you move from using data sets for training, you move to natural language examples, which we completely have to think in a different way to do. So watch this space, I would say. Well, from my side, if I see any paradigm change, then that's it. If we crack language and can use it in the way GPT-3 suggests, that will be a very different world, in particular in terms of working together with algorithms, because that's exactly what you do when you have to.
I'm very
sorry.
to ask for your email and to ask like what you find, because I was looking very quickly, and obviously I'm not a computer scientist, into this new big language models, and I couldn't differentiate the hype and the kind of the hype that kind of generated by the company to boost its shares from whether this is really like such a breakthrough, because it's like it also looked like a paid promotion campaign, and everyone saying, oh, it's such a breakthrough. And then some other people say, well, but it's still not like an amazing text. So, I mean, it's almost, I've been speaking about this recently. I became very suspicious because, I mean, of course, lots of things work, but also lots of things, they are like exaggerated for cultural purposes. There's a lot of, when you know the specificity, you can admire what works, but then a lot of things are just not true, because this is not how it works, and this is not at all what's happening. And it would be, I don't know, maybe you could get in touch so we could continue.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I think that will be, well, as I said, I haven't yet done the work, but what I expect is a very similar situation, that it's going to work well for some things and not to work well for others. For example, it should be very good in continuing or say text summarization, things like that. So I expect that I just give it an article and it gives me a summary of that, and I can prompt it to do things like summarize for primary school children, or summarize in a style of Laura Kunzbach, or whatever. Yeah, so that's something I expect is going to work well. But then on the other side of the spectrum, if I want to try to give it some music, like in any symbolic representation, I understand that the system has actually seen some of that and see how it does with that. And my expectation is that it's not going to do great, but let's see.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting if you could give it scientific or sociological papers to summarize, and then philosophical or theoretical ones. I expect it might not do so well on theoretical papers where, you know, which are much more complex in meaning, and people don't use keywords and don't actually use specific words repeatedly that are so it's yeah, but yeah, it would be really great to see what
to be honest, from what I've seen so far, I would expect it to work much better on philosophical texts than on some other things.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, that's really something to try out. And I guess my life is probably too short for that. But very happy to get in contact, and
yeah, please do
chatting about that. Yeah,
it would be lovely.
It's the best way to reach you
outside of this.
Okay. I'm wondering if we're like a bit too specific or technical now for the broader audience here. I don't actually know what everybody in the audience is actually doing, but
there's also a question in the chat.
Yes.
Francesco, do you want to ask your question yourself?
If you want to join us, I can. I have asked you to unmute yourself, but if not, we can just read it out.
Yeah, what, Francesco, do you want to ask the question, or? Okay, then I'll read it.
Okay.
What's your take on Lev Manovich's cultural analytics hypothesis, that is machines possibly becoming good art historians? What would that say about how we think of culture? Well, I don't mind. I find Lev Manovich's approach quite interesting. I don't always agree. It is, yeah, I'm not sure if they're really becoming good art historians, because what is a good art historian is not someone who knows a big data of images, but who finds specific links. But there are really interesting projects. So Leo Impet, a colleague of mine who works at Durham, he goes into trying to what we know from distant reading. He has worked with Francesco Moretti, and he tries to do a big data art history project, which is definitely interesting, especially if you think of style forms or forms, specific forms that come up, colors that come up over time. So in that sense, that works. But it's not replacing art history, of course. It's a very specific thing. But Leo also thinks of quite interesting new ways. So for example, most of the machine learning and image recognition vision research is now done with photos, of course, or videos from reality. And he's thinking about training a machine learning with images from the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, where the perspective wasn't there yet. So before the invention of perspective in the Renaissance. And that could be an interesting project, you know, how does a machine that learns to see with these pictures then starts to see reality? And it's quite good. So yeah, I think there's some interesting things with machines learning to see, or ways of technical seeing, but I don't think that they simply become good art historians, but they can assist art historians. Right.
Thank you for that. It's kind of interesting when, you kind of like, you know, don't have somebody sort of responding in this way, but thank you on behalf of Francesco and also everyone else. We do have another question.
Claire, hello, Claire. Now come a few questions. We take a few more and then we let everyone go to dinner. So what do we think is the relation between the digital subject and the subject of capital? Claire is asking that. Olga, I let you answer it.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to write like a book out of that article, and I think the digital subject is a certain form of abstraction that obviously has links to the history of the subject as a form of abstraction in modern, kind of in the modern subject history. So the subject of capital as well as the subject of proletariat and different kinds of abstractions of subjects are all kind of existing forms that this new digital subjects build on or work with or follow. I guess I can't answer more than that, but I think generally this kind of history of the production of the subject through abstracting is not something very new, and that's core to modernity. So of course, capital isn't escapable here. Alex, Anikina asks, Alex, do you want to say this yourself?
Or try. Unfortunately, yeah. I'm a tiny black square today. Sorry for that. So I've been trying to work lately on this idea of alienation and where exactly it's situated. And in the residency I'm in currently, we're reading a lot of Sylvia Wynter and her idea of how this humanness is a very constructed idea that it gets continuously kind of pushed forward as a part of neoliberal agenda. And there was a moment in which we kind of collectively thought that these moments of separation of technology, this Simondonian, what he hopes shouldn't happen, these moments are kind of necessary to continuously construct this human subject, because then it becomes the non-technology, non-animal. So somehow, and when I think about different bureaucratic structures, for example, when you get constructed very specifically as a subject, which are processed algorithmically, I think this also becomes very clear, this non-humanness. Or like Grant Bolmer writes about capture, that your humanness is not a given in the network. You have to physically confirm that, yes, you are a human. So yeah, this is not obviously a question. This is maybe just a request to talk a little bit more on these ideas of around detachment and alienation and Olga's non-relation in a way.
I mean, I can say something about it because I've been thinking about this, and I've been reading Wynter quite a lot and trying to think if I can say anything at all about that. And I think the problem is that, and I think Mercedes in her talk kind of alluded to that as well, there are these very strong traditions of thinking about technology and abstraction and generally, like, there's a very strong European tradition of considering technology as generally kind of anti-human. I mean, very Heideggerian, right? Or Husserl, and generally scientific arrangement of the world is something that is profoundly anti-human. And then there is this kind of form of, and I don't think I think it is true, but there is also a form in which you can't say the word abstraction without invoking the notion of violence. So this, and in Wynter specifically uses the kind of in that combination. And I don't think I have an answer yet. I've been thinking about that. And I also think that there is also a transformation around the notion of information that came with interesting sides of cybernetics and I mean, Sarah writes about information and physics and what is done to physics. And I also think that certain forms of abstraction or information are not necessarily only human. Like you could think about abstraction in relation to like how weather is formed. Like you can have something, an interaction between forces of geology, humidity, and they all come together to then abstract to the new level, and then they create a weather front. And I think similar things happen. Oops.
We have lost Olga, actually. I was even though I'm sad that we did, I was hoping that it was actually Olga and not me. So
Yeah,
the rest of us are still here.
she might come back. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna. Oh, there you are again, Olga. You just froze for a second.
Oh,
we can't hear you.
Let's just ask you to unmute yourself. There we go.
Responded to me passionately. Just quit.
Abstraction.
So, and I think again, this great urgency to rethink, you know, the unfairness and what's kind of happening with when machine learning is applied on old data sets, traditional practices, which results in direct discrimination, direct oppression. And it's like all this intertwinement of models and practices and histories, and it's super important. But I also don't think that the way that if you put technology entirely into this enemy camp, that it's gonna like help. I think it's something about like ontological position. And in the latest book by what's his name now? I can't remember. Shil Mbembe, I think, is that, did I pronounce it correctly? His name. He is very, very critical about digital media, but also kind of in a way that is very detached from the field. You know, it's so I think once you start looking at it and have to take a position, it's not so easy to say, oh, we should detach altogether and go, you know, in opaque, and that's the only thing we should consider.
I think I meant it less as my position, yeah, that I should detach, but more as these particular human models, yeah, and neoliberal ones, they have to continuously detach in order to in order to be effective, in order to work as these alienating mechanisms.
That's I think there are two things going on at the same time. And I think what's very interesting is if you read Winter or also read other contributions from sort of Black futurism, for example. Winter sort of explicitly, for example, in the ceremony found embracing more science and embracing technology in a specific way. Someone who wrote quite interesting about it, and the link to neoliberalism, is Shannon Winobst, who wrote about, and it's quite a sort of, I find it so parallel to observations we have. So she wrote about the subject becoming fungible. She wrote a book called Way Too Cool, but she also wrote a text about the fungibility of the subject in neoliberal times. And it is quite interesting that I think this is going on two levels. There's a way of detachment and alienation that is negative, in the sense of neoliberal capital asks you to become something that is exchangeable, something that is, or by now it doesn't even care if it's exchangeable, it just wants to pick, oh, you are good, your subjectivity is useful, and your subjectivity is useful, yours isn't. It doesn't even ask you to be a subject anymore, at least that's Shannon's point. But it's sort of flat, and it's the same flatness Olga and Antoinette Rouvois describes in a certain way, which is an interesting parallel. But I think there's also a detachment and alienation in a positive way, in the sense, for example, now we all need to be super engaged in our jobs and really love it. What about the way when we can be alienated from our jobs, go home at 5 and just call it a day and have, a really nice afternoon and evening, and then return to work at 8 o'clock? That option is completely gone. So there was a part in alienation and detachment that is humane to a certain extent even. And there is, if you return, but then you return to reading Hegel and all of that about Entfremdung and Verdopplung and alienation, there is a way of alienation that could be interesting to use against capitalism. And I think also an understanding of technology doesn't need to say technology is an alienation against the human, because I come there, that's where I would be against Simon Doyle, who's a bit too much of a humanist, even though he tries to merge technology and culture. He's for me a bit too much of a classic humanist. I'm really go more with Laurent Gourand and say tools is part of being human. The first thing you do is put a thumb into your mouth and you are your own tool. And that is just, a thing, how we work and how we are. So technology is not alienating, but we are alienated as soon as we come into the world, and more try to work from that. But now we are really deeply in how to live. Maybe we should move how to live with dinner into the next phase.
It's so interesting. It's such a good discussion. I'm enjoying it too much.
I was going to ask maybe, and it's sort of is linked to this, but on a practical level, I know you said you didn't change your email address, and also I wonder if you do actually still use Google, but do you have a practical bit of advice, because I guess it's kind of like a theme during the series that we ask everyone that
that is something I haven't figured out. I haven't figured out. Olga was just talking about the opaqueness to obscure. There is a school, and I really like him very much. Finn Brunton wrote a book about becoming obscure. Yeah, exactly. So vanishing and trying to irritate the system. That's one thing. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure. I'm like a mainstream user. I'm pushing DuckDuckGo. My partner uses the DuckDuckGo and stuff like that, and I think it's really good. But I'm like a normal person, and I'm not very critical in my usage. I'm still for open source and try, if I buy stuff, buy the open source thing, and I think that's the more important politics. But on the platform level, I think that part is lost, and I've just given up, and I probably should turn around and invest all the time I ask other people to invest and be a better technology user. So that could be my project for my sabbatical.
Cool, thank you. Maybe we'll follow your, your advice and changes.
There's a comment from Claire Redelman on that these last comments feel very compatible with Marx and Engels and the origin of family, private property, and the state. The idea that who uses the first moment of, is it humanness or the first historical action? Well, we are in the birth of capital, both as capital and das Kapital. So, it's only very appropriate.
Okay, I guess maybe we should close here if there are no more comments or thoughts from anyone. It's definitely prime dinner time, and I can hear all the scooters outside of the house now. Everyone is getting delivery in this neighborhood.
There's so much for detachments.
Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic event. I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks for staying with us, despite having been alienated by a vaccine today.
No, lucky. Thank you for your talk and for all the questions. They were so inspiring.
Yeah.
Thank you as well from me for accepting the invitation, and thank you to everyone else who has also made it to this point. It's great to have you with us.
Right.
Okay then.
Right.
So Good night,
Goodbye.
everyone. I love this sort of like waving thing from the screen. Have a good
Well, we need
night.
some physical action. It would be nice to go to pub now, but that's not possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Enjoy
Next
your night,
time.
everyone. And thank you again, Mercedes, for joining us. Bye.
Bye. Bye.